This homework is all about Hardy Weinberg equilibrium. So to best understand how to do these homework problems, we need to understand how to use the equations given us and how to manipulate it. So this here is the Hardy Weinberg equation. So let's break down this equation and talk about what it means. So P is the probability of receiving a dominant allele, big A, and Q is the probability of receiving a recessive allele, the little a. So we learn from this, we can easily see that P plus Q, the probability of receiving a big A plus the probability of receiving a little a, would equal 1. This equation, along with some others, are going to be very important in us answering these Hardy Weinberg questions. So let's look at the other equations. We'll make this smaller to get it out of the way. And we'll continue to break down this first equation. So P squared is the percentage of population with the big A genotype. 2PQ is the percentage of population with the big A, little a, the heterozygous genotype. And Q squared is the population with little a genotype. So anytime we're referencing P squared, Q squared, 2PQ, look back to these and think about what it is that those mean. So then the last of these equations that we're going to use are these two. P squared plus 2PQ is the dominant phenotype. Q squared is the recessive phenotype. So in these first three that we talked about here, it's talking about genotypes, and then these two are talking about phenotypes. So in all the problems on your homework and in tests and quizzes, use this equation, this first one that we have here, and remember these different parts that we broke down here to answer all the questions. If you're able to do this, you should have no issues with any of these problems. So as you can see, I've taken all the information we had on the last page. I've shrunk it down up into the top corner over here. So reference that when you have questions about what equation to use. Now let's look at a question. This is similar to your homework question. It says some autosomal dominant disease is found in 15% of the population. If the population is in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium, what is the frequency of the recessive allele? So we need to break this problem down to find out what it is that we know and what it is that the problem's asking. As we look at the question, the first thing we should ask ourselves is, have I been given a genotype / phenotype, or have I been given an allele frequency? In this example, we've been given a phenotype. It says that 15% of this population has this disease. They're showing this disease. So what that means is that, like I said, 15% have the dominant disease, so they are either big A, or big A, little a. So this also tells us that 85% of the rest of the population does not have the disease, which makes them little a homozygous recessive. So the question asks us for the frequency of the recessive allele. This can also be interpreted as the frequency of the little a allele. It's important to remember that any time a question is asking for an allele frequency, it means it's asking for a P or a Q value. Go ahead and pause the video and take a minute and think about how you can use one of these equations in the top left corner here to figure out what our allele frequency is. So to answer the question, we need to find out what this 15% and 85% really represent. The 15% given us represents the dominant phenotype, which we know from our equations equals P squared plus 2PQ, whereas the 85% represents the recessive phenotype, which equals Q squared. Like I mentioned earlier, because this question is asking for an allele frequency, it's wanting a P or a Q value. So because this equation here is a little bit easier to deal with, let's go ahead and solve for Q. So we have Q squared equals 0.85. So to solve for this, we take the square root of both sides, and it gives us our answer that Q equals 0.92. So in other words, the frequency of the recessive allele equals 0.92. So what if the problem then asked for the frequency of the dominant allele? So at this point, lots of people will make the mistake of trying to do the same thing we just did, and trying to solve this equation here for P. And if you do that, you're in for a whole lot of work and you won't get the answer. There's a much easier way to answer this question as we look back at our equations here and as we use this equation that I've got underlined. So as we use that P plus Q equals 1, we already know what Q is. So all we need to do is 1 minus Q, or 1 minus 0.92, equals P. And we get the answer of 0.08. So it's that simple. We can find the frequency of the dominant allele after already knowing the frequency of the recessive allele. So you can do this in both ways. If you know one frequency, you can easily figure out the other. Another commonly asked question is, what percentage of the population would we expect to be heterozygous big A, little a? So if you were given a question like this, all you would need to do is calculate P and Q like we did before, and then plug them into this equation, 2PQ. Since we already know what P and Q are, I've done it here. So 2 times P, or 0.08, times Q of 0.92 gives us an answer of 0.15. So 0.15, or 15%, is the percentage of the population that we would expect to be heterozygous big A, little a. One last question that we'll answer is, what percentage of the population would be homozygous dominant big A, big A? So it's also pretty simple to find this answer, but it's also simple to make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, that's just P. We already calculated P, so the answer is 0.8. But remember that the percentage of the population that's homozygous dominant big A, is not just P, but as you see over here, it's P squared. So now we just take the P value that we had before, 0.08, and square it, and we get the answer of 0.64, or in other words, 64% of the population will be homozygous dominant. Now, there should be enough information for you to answer all the questions in your homework as well as the tests. Remember that if you're ever confused, you can always go back to your equations. Those are going to be the most important thing with Hardy Weinberg, and I would suggest writing these down, memorizing them for the test.